Chapter 37. Ayianna stretched, her arms sore and heavy. On the edge of awareness, she burrowed deeper into the softness surrounding her and sought the oblivion of sleep again. An odd mix of happiness and grief followed her from her dreams and clung to her mind like veils of mist. What had she been dreaming? She blinked away the sleep and sat up. The room spun. She doubled over and closed her eyes. In the darkness, the world righted itself, and she took a deep breath. She caught a familiar yet strange scent. The smell drew her back into her dreams. She had been at a wedding. Her wedding. She wore a midnight blue dress swathed in layers upon layers of palest pinks and purples. People stood in lines, swirling and spiraling out to the edge of the large sacred ring. Inside she would find the sanctum, and there her beloved waited. Her heart rushed, but she would not. She danced slowly through the circular lines of people. White flowers rained around her. She stood on her tiptoes and tried to catch a glimpse of her betrothed, but it was no use. The people's arms waved and more flowers fell. Her mother appeared and slipped a delicate star-studded crown on her head. Beyond the rings of dancing people, her father and brother conversed. She called to them, but the clamor drowned out her voice. She continued to dance. She needed to find her beloved. Closer and closer she drew, until at last she passed the last person and stepped into the inner sanctum. Her beloved was not there. The happiness and love had felt so real, and the loss even sharper. Ayianna rubbed her face. It was only a dream which she already knew its outcome. Desmond. What had changed between them? Had she begun to trust him? She straightened and glanced around. Light streamed through an open window. A large oval hung from a wall and reflected light, brightening the room even more. A cushioned chair and a wooden wardrobe sat against the other walls. Where was she? What happened? Glimpses of smelly camels and tall, dark men slipped through her mind. Had they made it to Bonzapur? Ayianna crawled out of bed, and her long hair fell loose down her back, brushing against her naked skin. She gasped. Where were her clothes? She grabbed the frail linen blanket from the bed and wrapped it around her and darted to the wardrobe. Inside, she found her knapsack, her hairpin, and a few sleeveless tunics. She donned one of the shirts. The embroidered bottom hung at her knees, and the square neck drooped around her shoulders, but at least she wasn't naked anymore. She twisted her hair into a loose bun and stuck the hairpin into it. Now to find the others. She glanced out the window. A golden city sprawled in a lush oasis. Beyond its curtain walls, square adobe homes stacked atop each other in lined, narrow streets. In the distance, the sand dunes of the Zrayab desert stretched forever into the horizon. Home. She had never been so far from it, and now a vast sea of sand lay between them. She'd have to endure the heat, the sand, and its dangers all over again just to return. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to quell the rising nausea. Below, people flowed in and out like the ocean's surf. The dust from the desert swirled in the streets and most likely made its way into their homes. A brief memory of the grit covering the floors and walls of Zajur flitted through her mind. She couldn't imagine having to deal with the sand day in and day out. Her skin crawled just thinking about it. A knock broke her reverie. "Good morning, child." An elderly, dark-skinned woman greeted her with a nod. She carried a tray of flatbread and fruit in her hands, while a white towel and a blue garment draped over her arm. Tight gray curls hugged her dark face. A brown smock swung loosely above her bare feet as she walked. She set the tray on the small table next to the bed. "Good morning," Ayianna replied. "I am Golma. Have you slept well?" "Yes, thank you." "Please eat. You must be starving." Ayianna nodded. She selected a round flatbread and bit into it. It contained a nutty sweetness, and her stomach growled its thanks. She glanced up at Golma. "Do you know where my travel companions are?" My wolf. They are well. You've had a devoted visitor, but you were asleep. He is making sure the wolf is well cared for. Desmond. Ayianna couldn't help the grin. Where are they now? They are with the king. I am here to prepare you to meet the queen. Come. She disappeared through the doorway. The queen? Ayianna stuffed the rest of the flatbread into her mouth, grabbed another, and followed after Golma. The elderly servant led her through the castle's walls and upstairs into another hall, passing several guards on their way, each one dark-skinned and wearing only a deep green loincloth. Gold bands circled their biceps. They stood alert with a halberd in hand. "Have you been to Zaporza?" Golma asked. She stopped at a large door and pushed it open. Ayianna shook her head. The elderly woman went on to explain. "It's a bathhouse customary in Bonzapur. The waters have been freshly heated." The elderly woman pushed open a second door, and Ayianna halted. Naked women of all ages filled the spacious room. Some bathed in a large pool while others sat in a cloud of steam. Scores of female servants dressed in white smocks and gold bracelets attended to their needs, bringing towels, combing hair, and rubbing bodies with fragrant oils. Several servants fanned the fires and placed heated stones in the pool. The rocks hissed, sending steam rolling out of the water. "My child, wash and dress." Golma set the towel and blue garment on a stone bench and turned to go. "But where are my clothes?" Ayianna tried to focus on Golma's face, but caught sight of a bare-breasted woman behind her. She glanced away and saw the backside of another woman. Finally, Ayianna just stared at the floor. "They are not fit to wear, so the queen has supplied you with new clothes. The maidservants will assist you when you are finished bathing. I leave you now." Ayianna glanced up. Golma bowed her head and ducked out of the room. Ayianna turned toward the wall and her hair fell down over her face. She quickly braided it and piled it atop her head and jabbed the pin in it again. But this time she pricked her scalp. She gritted her teeth. "Of all the things, I have to go and poke my head." Her trembling fingers tugged at her nightgown. Her temples tightened as heat flooded her face. She glanced at the pool. The other women chatted, quite comfortable with each other's nudity. At least they all looked alike, not her. Her olive skin glared out of place like a weed in a lovely flower garden. Ayianna swallowed, took a deep breath, and then pulled off her nightgown. She darted to the edge of the pool and stepped in. She sank beneath the surface until only her head remained above. The waters were hot and perfumed. She closed her eyes. The embarrassment slowly subsided, and her thoughts slipped to her betrothed. Desmond had checked on her. Devoted, Golma had said. It thrilled her and scared her. Was she ready? Marriage. Oh, her heart was a fickle thing. She had to see him again. She needed confirmation. Oh, Saren, what am I to do? If he is my chosen husband, what else is there to do but accept? I've not been good at this praying thing, but please, Zabi! A voice wrenched Ayianna from her thoughts as a young girl emerged from the water next to her. Ja'azerli, you are not from here. Are you the new Yasaro, the king's mate? Ayanna's hand slipped. Her head went under. She came back up, spitting out water. The perfumes left a bitter taste in her mouth. "Are you fine?" the girl asked. Her accent weighed on her words as if she was speaking through her teeth. Colorful beads adorned her black braids, swirling tightly around her head and spilling down her neck. Long eyelashes lined her eyes, and her dark, round face was youthful, full of expression, and without a care. Ayianna coughed but nodded. Aware of how close the young girl was, Ayianna inched away, but the pool's cold ledge halted her retreat. "Well, are you?" The young girl stared unflinching into Ayanna's eyes. "Am I what?" "The new mate. How you call it? The new wife. Everyone has been speaking of her. The king announced it last week. Tonight we celebrate the Hasquare, the union." Ayianna crossed her arms. She couldn't remember how clear the water was, but she wasn't going to take any chances. "How many wives does the king have?" "5. Ayianna raised her eyebrows. How could a king have more than one wife? Badera might allow its men to take as many as 3 wives, but not the king. The birthright would be a mess. Who would succeed him? The girl toyed with one of her braids. So what are you doing here? Here, Ayianna frowned. I'm trying to bathe. Without a sponge? The girl laughed. She swam over to the other ledge where a basket of sponges sat. Silly foreigners. She flung the braids over her shoulder and returned. Here, you use this sponge to clean your pale skin. It has come from Ganya. The Kaleki harvest them. Can you imagine how fine it would be to meet a merman? Ayianna accepted the sponge. The girl stared off into the distance. Her eyes grew wistful. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Not enough time for the world to crush her dreams. The girl's attention returned to Ayianna and she tilted her head. Sand and water do not mix, do they? She shrugged and began scrubbing her own body. Everyone is preparing for the king's wedding feast and speculating about the new mate. She leaned closer and whispered, It will be the biggest celebration of them all. The other mates have been preparing her room, but no one has seen her yet. So, the others are not jealous? Ayianna asked. How could they be? They are married to the king of Bonzapur. The girl splashed the water. Ayianna tilted her head. Does that mean there are 5 queens? The girl laughed. No, he has 1 Fratharo. The other wives are called the Yahero, and their firstborns are entitled to rule one day. They may rule the cities of the desert, but only firstborn of the Frahero may rule Bonzapur. I am Liara, firstborn, but my mother is Yahero. One day I shall rule one of the desert cities like the wind. The little girl flung her long, thin braids over her shoulder. I wouldn't be too excited about living in the desert. Ayianna scrubbed her arms with the sponge. She cringed under its rough texture, her skin still tender. You are beautiful. You could be the new mate, Liara smiled. Thank you, but I am betrothed to another man. Oh, I see. Liara tossed her spun at the basket, but it missed and it tumbled beyond it. Their conversation lilted. But then Ayianna caught sight of a man walking across the smooth stone floor. Ayianna gasped. What is he doing in here? That is Silo. He is a Habur Pujath. He is not a Haru. How do you call it? He's a eunuch. A what? He has no... The girl bit her lower lip and glanced away. You know, he has been cut. He is safe. The king trusts him to guard his harem. Harem? Where do you come from? You know nothing of our culture. You must be a puspa, a commoner. I'm from the Prothe Plains, on the other side of the Rusat Mountains, and I'm quite sure you know nothing of my culture, or the culture of the elves or dwarves either, Ayianna replied. Perhaps, but I have read about their cultures. You can't learn everything in books. What would a puspa know about books? Your culture, you do not teach the people to read, except the nobility. Ayianna stared at her. Why was she even bothering to argue? Liara lifted her head. I must go. You finish bathing before your skin wrinkles or the oil will fall off. She neared the shallows and stood. Oil? Ayianna averted her gaze only to see another woman in all her naked glory step into the pool. The servants will oil your skin to make it smell good and protect it from the dryness of the desert. Liara shook her head as 2 maidservants engulfed the little girl in the towel. Obviously, you should try not to be so ignorant of other cultures. Ayianna took a deep breath. Why did the girl rile her so? She swam to the edge, climbed out, and stormed to her towel. She rigorously dried her body, but then noticed the 2 maidservants drawing near. One held an ornate jar filled with oil. The other took her towel. Ayanna's anger fled, and embarrassment rushed in as the maidservant poured the contents of the jar over her shoulders, while the other rubbed the fragrant oil into her skin. Ayianna closed her eyes and counted. Once she had dressed, she breathed easier. The servants led her past a polished metal rectangle that hung like a painting on the wall. She paused. A young woman with her mother's face and her father's hair stared back at her. She tilted her head. The soft blue blouse buttoned down the front and then split into several flowing long rectangular strips of fabric. that covered a deeper blue pants that swirled when she walked. "Beautiful," Goma had returned. "The queen is waiting." King Ronako hadn't moved since Kale had relayed what happened in Zajur. The king stood at the large window and looked down upon his golden city. He wore no clothes except a white skirt-like wrap which contrasted with his dark, polished skin. A wide gold belt circled his waist. The ambassadors of the northern and southern province conversed quietly across the room, glancing every so often at the king. Lord Niacin, ambassador present in the south, was tall and skinny like a graceful hound. On the other hand, Lord Maldi, ambassador Zaffa, was short and stubby like an old bulldog. Each wore a white linen tunic and a woven band of colourful threads around his forehead. Runako turned from the window. "I am thankful my warriors made it in time to save you, but sad we had not heeded Iluith's advice sooner. You will be safe here. My library is at your service, and I hope you find what you are looking for. I am uncertain what Iluith has accomplished, but my nephew Tarik will aid you in your search." "Thank you, your majesty," Kale bowed. One of the lords cleared his throat, and Mahdi stepped forward. "If I may be permitted to speak, Frau Rojipa." King Runako nodded. Mahdi smiled. His yellowed teeth blinked against his dark lips. The folds of his weathered skin hid his eyes, except when he arched his brows and exposed their creamy whites. "Does this mean you have made your decision to join the alliance?" "Lord Mahdi, you are here on behalf of my brother to discuss this. Why would I decide before then?" He bowed. "But of course, I mean no disrespect. But are you not now giving assistance to the Nevins by allowing these persons access to the royal library? Might I remind you that the Nevins refused our request for aid during your father's reign?" He paused, but quickly added, "My jipa." "Mahdi," Lord Niacin spoke up, "we were not the only nation with difficulties during that time. Do not waste the jipa's time on grudges." "Well spoken." Runako turned to Mahdi. "What I decide to do with my library is my business. What the nation of Bonzapur will or will not do will be decided the day after tomorrow. Let us not get ahead of ourselves. Tonight, I and all of Bonzapur will celebrate my union." "Of course, Mijipa." Mahdi bowed deeply. "Kale, please rest today and join us in our celebration this evening. I will see that you and your companions are well accommodated." Kale nodded. "Thank you, your majesty." He turned and strode from the room. He clenched his jaw. Merriment was the last thing he needed. Where was Vi and Desmond? They couldn't still be sleeping, could they? He'd wake them this time, and then he'd find Iluith and see what he had uncovered in the library.